Buenas tardes, bienvenidos una vez más al canal de YouTube del Instituto Cervantes, Leeds and Manchester, a esta serie sobre este redescubrimiento de España con la catedrática Kirsty. Welcome to the Instituto Cervantes Leeds and Manchester YouTube channel and to a new event on the series coordinated by Professor Kirsty, to whom I extend a warm welcome and to all of you as well. This is the second lecture in the series Encuentro in Spain of this year. And it's a series that from the beginning has been dealing with exploring the different and diverse parts of Spain from the perspective of the 19th and 20th century British travelers and expats who encountered and discovered a country very varied, very diverse and very different. Well, what is the sunny south, the tradition image about some of the people have about Spain? Well, today the talk would be about the sunny Spain, the Canary Islands. I hope, I am sure we will discover many different aspects from the Canary Islands. And Canary Islands, and most of you know, is a place in the Atlantic with the 8 islands with a rich culture, very diverse in itself, not only the peninsula, but the Canary Islands have been influenced from the many different cultures that have been through these islands through hundreds of years of miscegenations, and from these influences from Africa, Europe, and America have created this unique culture. Thanks to the reality, you can find very different architecture from Gothic, Mudéjar, Renaissance, Baroque. I would like to underline also that it's only in the 15th century when the Spain arrived, the Spanish to the Canary Islands, and it became part of the Spanish kingdom. Well, the first settlers developed a culture full of expressions with sculpture, ceramics, and immaterial festivals that are present to the day. Well, today we will analyze, Professor Kirsty will look at the Canary Islands and explore how the Victorians and the Edwardian travelers experienced these islands. On the one hand, very exotic and very out of the common reality in the north of Europe, but on the other hand, also full of English and very much influenced also by the English culture. But before I give the floor to Professor Kirsty, let me introduce her. She is doctor and professor of the Hispanic Studies at Warwick University, and she's a specialist in Spanish, Anglo-Spanish, and Galician cultural history since 1800. Her books include Writing Galicia into the World, Mondariz Vigo Santiago, A Brief History of Galicia's Edwardian Tourist Boom, and the Edwardians and the Making of a Modern Spanish Obsession. She currently has been holding the 11th major research fellowship for the project Hispanic London Culture, Commerce, and Community in the 19th Century City. Thank you again, Kirsty. Thank you to all of you. I remind also that at the end of the talk, we will have like 15 minutes for questions and answers. You are very welcome to participate and to put your questions on our chat. And without further ado, te paso la palabra, Kirsty. Muchísimas gracias a todos ustedes por acompañarnos.
Muchísimas gracias. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be back talking to you about another fascinating part of Spain. So you're probably all familiar with the Canary Islands as one of the most popular overseas destinations for British tourists. Last year's statistics for 2022 tell us that just under 5 million British visitors made their way to the Canary Islands that year, which is a fantastic recovery from the lows of the COVID pandemic. So the modern history of tourism to the Canary Islands really begins during the 1880s with the establishment of British coaling stations for steamships there. But the British relationship with the islands goes back several centuries earlier than that. So I thought I'd start today with the stories of just a handful of the intrepid travellers who made their way there in the days before steamships, holiday tours, or even hotels. So one of the earliest British accounts of leisure travel in the Canary Islands dates from the late 17th century, when a group of English merchants who lived at Orotava on Tenerife recorded their 3-day journey to the top of what they called the Pike of Tenerife, which is, of course, Mount Teide, the great volcano. It was a difficult physical journey. Around a mile up, they wrote, "Some of our company grew very faint and sick, disordered by vomitings and aguish distemper, our hair standing up like bristles. Fortunately, they brought plenty of wine with them, although it was so cold as to be undrinkable until they'd warmed it on the fire. Once they finally reached the summit, braving what they called a continual perspiration of a hot and sulphurous vapour that made our faces extremely sore, they drank King Charles II's health and fired each of us a gun before having dinner, accompanied by a wine that they said was more brisk and spirituous than before. When they eventually arrived back in Orotava, they said our faces were so red and sore that to cool them, we were forced to wash and bathe them in whites of eggs," which sounds delightful. Several decades later, the Scottish merchant adventurer George Glass also visited what he also called the Pike. Now, Glass was a very colourful character who traded between Brazil, West Africa and the Canary Islands, and he lived in the Canaries for about 7 years. In 1764, he established a trading station on the West African coast, which he hoped the British government would formalise. And in the same year, he also published a translation of the Spanish history of the Canary Islands with some added material of his own. Glass's journey up the Pike was made in both the literal and textual footsteps of his English predecessors. He travelled with a guide and some muleteers who brought him to what he called some great loose rocks, where there was a sort of cottage built of loose stones. The name of this place, our guide told us, was Estancia de los Ingleses, i.e. the English pitching place. So called, I imagine, from some English people resting there on their way to visit the Pike. For none go that journey but foreigners and some poor people of the island, who earn their bread by gathering brimstone, the Spanish gentry having no curiosity of this kind. At the top of the Pike, he found its dimensions seemed to be exactly as described by one Mr. Eden, whose journey to the Pike we find related in some of our accounts of the Canary Islands. But Glass also thought about the people who would follow him in his own footsteps. If any person intends to visit the Pike, he said, I would advise him to wait for fine, clear weather, carry a good tent, plenty of water, and some provisions along with him, that he may be enabled to remain at the estancia 4 or 5 days, in which time he might go twice or thrice to the top of the Pike and make his observations at leisure. Now, shortly after publishing this book, Glass was imprisoned for almost a year on Tenerife by the Spaniards, who were concerned that his activities on the African coast were a prelude to a British attempt to conquer the Canaries. The following year, he and his family came to a very violent end when they were killed by mutineers on the voyage home to England. And the story of their lives and violent deaths is said to be the basis for Stevenson's famous novel, Treasure Island. The third and last of the early travellers I want to introduce you to is the English writer and artist, Mrs. Elizabeth Murray. Very different kettle of fish. Murray left England at the age of 18 to travel with her father, who was also an artist. Eventually, she married a British diplomat she'd met in Morocco. And when her husband was appointed British consul to Tenerife, they settled there in 1850. On leaving the Canaries in 1859, after almost a decade, she published a detailed and very forthright 2-volume memoir, which is called 16 Years of an Artist's Life in Morocco, Spain, and the Canary Islands. The vast majority of the memoir is about her time in the Canaries. Now, Elizabeth Murray is mostly remembered today in the Canary Islands for her art. She's said to have introduced the art of watercolour painting to Tenerife, and her writing is strongly shaped by her artist's eye. Arriving into, thank you, my screen's being funny. Arriving into the harbour of Santa Cruz in 1850, for example, she was completely awestruck on seeing the famous peak, which she called a spectacle which has nothing to match it in any other part of the world, rising in unspeakable grandeur, while the atmosphere through which you gaze upon it is of that matchlessly beautiful ethereal tint, which defies all the skill of art and all the means that art can employ to imitate. Of course, Murray would nonetheless do her best to imitate that ethereal tint, and her watercolours of Tenerife, several of which are reproduced in her memoir, provide a touching glimpse of the island and its people during the 1850s. So Murray and her husband settled at the British consulate in Santa Cruz, a town she found pleasing and picturesque from the sea, but closer up, hot and dusty and inhabited by, I quote, the unendurable pest of its gossip-loving community, who, in their friendly anxiety to keep me au courant of all the paltry scandal, tittle-tattle and small talk of the place, scarcely allowed me a moment for my own reflections. Escaping from Santa Cruz as often as she could, she spent much of her time touring the countryside, accompanied only by my boy and a single servant, since her husband was kept busy in town. Like earlier and later British visitors to the Canaries, Murray was especially interested in learning about the Guanches, that is, the island's indigenous inhabitants. The very first stop on her first tour was Matanza, a name which means slaughter, and which she writes not entirely correctly, is where one of those most fearful slaughters by which the Spanish made themselves the object of so much dread to the Aborigines took place. In fact, as writers from Humboldt onwards have recorded, Matanza was the site of the Guanches' slaughter of their Spanish invaders. Still, Murray was deeply affected by the site's history. The scenery, she said, is among the finest in Tenerife, but it is awful to think, as we cannot help thinking when actually on the spot, of the human blood with which it has been drenched. In the absence of any infrastructure at this time aimed at tourists and travellers, Murray made her own way, staying with willing individuals and acquaintances. So in Matanza, for example, she found herself billeted with the principal lady of the village, a very important personage in her own estimation, who kept a camel to turn her wheat mill, a goat to nurse her children, and a tombstone on the staircase. It is impossible, writes the rather ungrateful Murray, to give a faithful description of the perfect purgatory in which I existed during the time I was domiciled with this family. Fortunately, however, the landscape provided, and Murray found that there was in the external aspect of the place much that compensated for the many little persecutions I had to endure. On longer acquaintance, Murray found the island, while grand, beautiful, magnificent in nature, to have the misfortune to be associated with all that is mean, contemptible, and repulsive in man, of whom the Lady of Matanza was just the first example. She loathed the polite society of Santa Cruz and other large towns. She detested the Spanish authorities, and particularly the class of government employee or civil servant, whom she found, in many respects, one of the greatest annoyances of Spain and all her possessions. She was horrified by the saddening and humiliating spectacle of the island's large population of beggars, asking, what language can I use in which to describe the unutterably low, degraded, humbled condition in which I found so many individuals of what I must now consider a generally abject race? Tenerife itself, Murray found not nearly so prosperous and promising as it once was, primarily thanks to the destruction of the vines, which constituted the main resource of the inhabitants from powdery mildew in 1852. Despite the near collapse of the island's economy, the government had refused to lower taxation, so that, Murray wrote, none of the inhabitants' burdens were alleviated, and they were compelled to pay the same amount of contributions to the Spanish officials as before the period of their adversity. This Murray attributes to her detested civil servants, who weigh like an incubus on the industry of the people, there being far too many military men, clerks, and similar for the size of the island, all of them, she says, idling away their time under the rather sarcastic appellation of employees. According to Murray, we can scarcely feel surprised that so wretched a system is productive of the most unhappy results on the character of the people. If they are tricky, grasping, and rapacious, who can blame them, when the government, which should protect and cherish them, so unmercifully robs them of their little acquisitions? And it may not be surprising to you that Murray's book did not go down well in Tenerife. Thanks to a vociferous local backlash to her, shall we say, forthright criticisms, within a few months of publication, her husband had requested a new consular posting, and in 1860, the couple left the Canaries for the American city of Portland, Maine. Within 25 years of Murray's departure, the islands that she had found at once so beautiful and so disappointing would be transformed, along with their place in the British imagination. Although, as we'll see, the contrasts she'd observed were still central to the experience of the growing numbers of British visitors. The transformation began early in the 1880s, when several Liverpool-based shipping companies, including Elder Dempster, the British and African Steam Navigation Company, and the African Steamship Company, established tours to the Canary Islands as a means of exploiting spare capacity on the first leg of their sailings from Liverpool to West Africa and the Caribbean. Many of these routes stopped first at the Portuguese island of Madeira, some 6 days' sail from Liverpool, before continuing the additional day or two to Tenerife. Now, these tours were both relatively affordable and relatively direct. In October 1886, a full-price return ticket with the African Steamship Company, open for 6 months, was £25, with frequent sales bringing prices down as low as £15 return. When the Wolverhampton author Charles Edwards travelled to Tenerife on board the SS Niger in 1887, his voyage from Liverpool took 8 days. Meanwhile, a direct sailing from a southern port, such as Plymouth or Dartmouth, could be as short as 4 or 5 days. The immediate popularity of these tours meant they could sometimes be booked beyond capacity, and Charles Edwards did not enjoy his sailing to Tenerife from Liverpool, because he said the ship was so crowded that for the final 2 days of the 8 from Liverpool to Tenerife, people slept on the dining tables and under them, like the dregs of a debauch. For a steamship company, this was admirable, but for us, who were not so interested in its dividends, it was not so pleasant. The Canary Islands were a logical stopping point for British ships, not only because of their strategic position at the midpoint between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, but because of their role as an important coaling station, where ocean liners bound for the Cape, Australia, the West Indies, and Brazil could refuel before undertaking the long crossing. Although Santa Cruz was the Canaries' earliest established coaling port, operating from 1838, Las Palmas quickly overtook it to become the principal coaling port. When the British writer Olivia Stone made her first visit in 1883 and 1884, she noted that there was just one English boat calling at Las Palmas in each direction per month, besides a monthly French and a fortnightly Spanish boat. By 1888, the journalist Harold Lee could report that the port was hosting more than 50 steamers a month. As Stone presciently observed, the question of coal affects very closely the welfare of the Canaries, and especially of Tenerife. The Liverpool journalist Harold Lee, writing in 1888, noted the impact of what he called this English enterprise on Gran Canaria in particular. He said, "Recognising its special advantages as a coaling station for steamers, an extensive depot has been formed here by the Grand Canary Coaling Company, an undertaking which has its headquarters at Liverpool. The facilities offered by this company have proved so conspicuous that many steamers which previously coaled at the Cap de Verde Islands now prepare to do so here, with the result that Grand Canary is growing rapidly in commercial importance." Similarly, Stone notes that Madeira-based businesses, such as the leading winemakers Messrs. Blandy Brothers, were also now moving their coaling to Las Palmas. The importance of Gran Canaria as a coaling station stimulated further Spanish and British investment in the port. So in 1888, again, Lee writes, the Spanish government have voted £350,000 for the construction of the port works, which are being carried out by British contractors under the superintendence of their representative, Mr. R.A. Biggleston. Although British coal dominated the market until the entry of German coal in around 1906, the English connection wasn't restricted to the coaling station. Olivia Stone, writing on her second visit in 1889, observed that perhaps what strikes one as most remarkable from a commercial point of view is that the trade here in Gran Canaria, and in Tenerife to a less extent, is chiefly in the hands of English people. She noted that English growers were buying up large quantities of land to cultivate produce, especially bananas and potatoes, for the English market, while a Manchester company, Messrs. Lathbury, were currently engaged in laying down vast sugar plantations. So, together with all of these works, the new tours created an unprecedented boom in British tourism to the Canary Islands, principally Gran Canaria and Tenerife, whose scale is clear from the torrent of guidebooks, handbooks, and travel memoirs that flowed onto the market, beginning rather suddenly in 1887. Among the travel guides appearing in that first boom year of 1887 was Tenerife and its 6 satellites by Olivia M. Stone, with photographs by her husband, the lawyer and journalist J. Harris Stone. Stone's book was first published in 2 rather large volumes in 1887, and then it was reissued 2 years later after she'd been back in a new and revised single volume edition, still of more than 500 pages. In the preface to the second edition, Stone portrays herself as a pioneer, claiming that the first edition of her book was a key factor in the island's sudden rise to fame. When we went to the Canary Islands in 1883 and 1884, she writes, they were practically unknown to the English. No other English people had then travelled through the archipelago. We had to endure labours and discomforts of which the following pages can give only a faint idea. But we have had the satisfaction of knowing that through the publication of the first edition of this book, the Fortunate Isles were, for the first time, prominently brought to the notice of the English public. When we first travelled in the islands, there were not more than a dozen visitors to be found in the archipelago, and that handful only in the 3 chief towns. Since the publication of Tenerife and its 6 satellites, visitors have poured into the islands, and their number is constantly on the increase. Stone was also keen to establish herself as an authority on the islands, scathingly dismissing her fellow authors, who she says, though only personally acquainted with one spot in one island, have ventured to write generally and dogmatically of the whole group. The result, she complains, has been that much misleading and even erroneous information concerning the islands has appeared in several prominent journals and magazines. The only exception she acknowledges is that accurate observer and unfortunate mariner, Captain George Glass, whose writings of more than 120 years earlier she frequently evokes. Fortunately, of course, Stone is here to remedy the distinct lack of accuracy she has observed in Glass's successors. It is an object of this edition, she writes, to correct some of these misstatements, while presenting the story of our original travel in a more compact and practical form. Again, I say 500 pages, it really isn't very compact or very practical. She based much of her authority on having visited every single island, even the tiny Hierro, of which she writes, so far as we could ascertain, no English-speaking person has been on the island of Hierro since the days of Columbus. Even Glass, whose accounts of the other islands still remain the most accurate, never visited this island himself, so we have not the benefit of his experience. It is therefore with somewhat of the feelings of discoverers and pioneers that we approach the most westerly island of the Canarian archipelago. Many of the less adventurous fellow authors whom Stone dismissed so scathingly were not completists or adventurers like her, but were writing specifically for the thousands of health tourists who were now making their way to the Canaries, clutching titles such as A Summer Climate in Winter, Gran Canaria as a Health Resort, The English in Canary Isles, The Canaries for Consumptives, and The Canary Islands as a Winter Resort, all of them published between 1887 and 1890. Others, like Wolverhampton-based journalist Charles Edwards' Rides and Studies in the Canary Islands, which came out in 1888, were written for the entertainment both of those who visit the Canary Islands and those who do not. Undoubtedly, the most successful of all the Canary Island guides, however, because it expressly addressed both health tourists and leisure travellers, was Alfred Samler Brown's Madeira and the Canary Islands, a guide for the use of invalids and tourists. The first edition came out in 1889, and it was still being reprinted as late as 1932. So all of the islands, thousands, tens of thousands of visitors at this time arrived by ship, and the stately approach by water is often framed in written accounts as a transition between continents. This is especially true of Gran Canaria. Olivia Stone wrote on arriving at Las Palmas that we seem to have left Europe in Tenerife and reached Africa in Gran Canaria, so different do the houses appear. For Harold Lee, no one approaching for the first time the chief town of Grand Canary can fail to be struck by its pronounced Eastern, or at all events Moorish appearance. It is a city of flat-roofed houses, whose white or yellow-coloured walls, jutting balconies, green-tinted shutters and upspringing minaret towers suggest at once and unmistakably an origin in the far past and burning climes. This was not just true for a distance. Margaret d'Este King, who visited Las Palmas early in 1908, found the Santa Catalina Hotel an oasis in a weary land. The tropical creepers outside, the bleached grass, the dusty spaces of earth round the palm trees, and the hoopoes calling about the grounds recalled for us an Egyptian garden. Tenerife, too, gave its visitors the feeling of being somewhere other than Europe. Charles Edwards found that from the water, Santa Cruz has the gay air of a Levantine city, while King, arriving in 1907, remarked that people who have been in the West Indies say that they might imagine themselves landing in Cuba when they come here. More often, however, visitors seeing Santa Cruz for the first time were overwhelmed by the city's backdrop. The Stones sailed in, gazing up at the volcanic mountains behind the city, which Olivia found grey and basaltic in appearance, with a frightfully convulsed and contorted surface. It only requires the appearance of a cone in the distance to confirm the feeling of awe with which one approaches this monument of a force that commands the respect and excites the terror of the most careless of mankind. Edwards, too, found that the town is nothing to its surroundings. Florence Duquesne, sailing into Santa Cruz in 1910, was rather less impressed, remarking that probably many people have shared my feeling of disappointment on landing at Santa Cruz, which, though one of the oldest towns in the Canaries, looked as though it had been built yesterday or might still be in the course of construction. Its utter hideousness, she writes, was a shock to me. And contrast is a central theme of writers' responses, above all to Tenerife. For example, Olivia Stone, sailing into Santa Cruz, overwhelmed by the mountains, writes, "Suddenly, as we round a point, our feelings and the landscape are relieved by a tiny valley embedded between the precipices and brilliant with the perfect green that is only observable where the contrast is severe." Similarly, as Charles Edwards gazes down into the valley of Orotava from our surroundings of flowering geraniums, bananas and prickly pears, he sees a village nestled in a wood of great chestnut trees, the purple hue of which tells us more easily than the naked eye that they have not yet unfurled a single leaf. In one part of the valley, all is florid and tropical. In another, we are, as it were, in Norway or Sweden, and both are visible at the same time. It is the fashion with visitors, Edwards says, to decry Santa Cruz. They use it as a stepping stone to the other side of the island and lament when they are obliged to return to it. This is hard on the town, which is at least worth a leisurely inspection. Olivia Stone was one of those who found Santa Cruz disappointing, although it is the island's capital and the principal port of call, she writes, and so gets all the trade and all the strangers. Unfortunately, however, it is not a town, nor has it the surroundings that tempt foreigners to stay in the island, and upon seeing it, many turn away and direct their footsteps elsewhere. Stone's dislike for Santa Cruz, however, stems directly from her rather boosterish love for the small town of Orotava. If only, she says, people could land at Orotava instead. The case for Orotava lies in a nutshell. It is beautiful. If Orotava could only be the port of call, strangers would learn that Tenerife is not the barren desert it has been imagined to be from its eastern side, and money would flow from other countries into the island, rendering it rich, prosperous, and happy. Sometimes, amid all of this strangeness, the islands could provide moments of familiarity. Walking on Lanzarote, Olivia Stone came across first a lane of the Devonshire order, between high walls lined with mulberry and chestnut trees, and then what she called a Surrey lane, beside which there was a house approached by an avenue of vines, although the illusion she found was rather dispelled by the surrounding cacti. On Lanzarote, she found the view from her bedroom window reminded one of many a village in Cambridgeshire. Visiting the house of the Marquesa de la Quinta Roja on Tenerife, she found that, were it not for the coffee trees and other tropical plants, we might fancy ourselves in an old English garden, and from this side the house looks like an English cottage, long, low and tiled. At Laguna, meanwhile, what delighted our English eyes was a piece of green sward, which, though small, was level and green as an English lawn. Within just a few years, the Canary Islands, and above all Tenerife and Gran Canaria, were firmly established as a favoured British holiday destination. In the preface to the second edition of his 1888 Handbook to Madeira and the Canary Islands, the Liverpool journalist Harold Lee noted that the access of English visitors to the islands, which has followed the establishment of the system of tours from Liverpool, has stimulated the inhabitants to augment in many ways the facilities for the comfort and enjoyment of the traveller during his stay. Not all of these were aimed at the health tourist. Charles Edwards, perhaps venturing into places his more staid fellow authors feared to tread, found himself in the back streets close to the port, where he confessed, "I was confronted with staring signboards inviting the stranger in bad English to enter, drink rum, and have a good time." When Olivia Stone returned for a second visit to the islands in 1888, 5 years after that first visit that she described as so pioneering, the chief and radical alteration, she observed, is to be found in the increased and improved accommodation for visitors, particularly for invalids and health seekers. In the principal towns, first-class hotels and sanatoriums have been built, and more are in course of construction. Banks, unknown in the days of our first visit, are established. An English chaplain is now living at Orotava, and a church is projected. Hotels have sprung up, and the few large seaport towns have somewhat changed their character as they have improved their accommodation. When the Stones first visited Las Palmas in 1883, there was no English hotel, and so they stayed at the Fonda de Europa, a former English merchant's house, which must have been larger than the designation fonda or inn suggests, since she said it can comfortably house 40 people. By 1888, the city's 2 Spanish hotels have been joined by an English one. Harold Lee, in his handbook of that year, noted that those to whom English proprietary and systems are a desideratum will probably find Quine's English hotel more to their taste, but that Ramon's Spanish hotel, which was 2 shillings a day cheaper, offered exceeding comfortable quarters and had recently introduced an English table. Stone, evidently up to date on local news, announced in the second edition of her book that another English hotel, the Santa Catalina, was due to open in October 1889. Founded by the English Canary Island Company, the Santa Catalina was, relatively speaking, a monster, built to house the same number of guests as Quine's and the Grand combined. The work of an English architect, she writes, it has something of an indigenous air, the style being Moorish, and thus wholly in keeping with its surroundings and the sentiments of the Isleños. Fortunately, while the exterior is typically Canarian, the interior is not. Stone says the whole building, like the rest of Las Palmas, is Moresque, but with kitchen and sanitary arrangements à l'anglaise. Las Palmas British hotels were at the hub of a thriving expat community that included permanent, long, and short-term residents. As early as 1888, Harold Lee was reassuring his readers that an English medical practitioner will shortly be established in the city, while the English residents have organised a tennis club which is well supported, play going on daily. The city would not get its own general English club until 1908, but as Brown noted, the place of an English club is filled to a certain extent by the hotels themselves, which have maintained for many years the admirable custom of inviting guests at other hotels when dances or entertainments are given. The city was also well set up for British leisure pursuits, since, owing to the enterprise of the English residents, a very fair cricket ground, a golf links, and several lawn tennis courts have been laid out in convenient positions, a fact of the utmost importance to most of the visitors. Olivia Stone was a bit less enthusiastic about these innovations, finding to her disgust that the ubiquitous Saxon has succeeded in laying the definite impress of his own particular civilization upon Las Palmas. Over on Tenerife, visitors had an even greater choice of English hotels. In his 1888 handbook, Madeira and the Canary Islands, published in 1888, Harold Lee noted 3 English hotels in Santa Cruz alone: Camachos, the International, and a new one under the management of Mr. Clark. The first named has a distinction of priority and date. Camacho himself, a Portuguese by birth, but an old resident in Santa Cruz, speaks English not perhaps exactly as she is wrote, but more than sufficient for practical purposes, and will be found a trustworthy and attentive, as well as an amusing host. The International, which is under English management, is a good house, while Mr. Clark, in his recently opened establishment, has been successful in winning golden opinions from his guests. Edwards, who visited round about the same time as Lee, found the 2 English hotels engaged in an advertising war. Each, he said, advertises its rivalry to the other by conjuring me to believe that it is the better and that nowhere else in the town is English spoken. Worse, he says, the Anglo-mania has touched Santa Cruz. Pale ale in the familiar bottles is an article of common use here. Camachos, as Lee notes, was the oldest of the English hotels, and that's where the Stones stayed on their first visit to Tenerife in 1883. Here they encountered a number of the island's British residents, or at least the gentlemen, who boarded at Camachos during the hot season while their families stayed in the comparatively cooler air of nearby La Laguna. We had, remarked Olivia Stone, quite an English-speaking tableful. Their experiences of hotel life, however, left much to be desired. The hotel, being the only English one and therefore rejoicing in a monopoly of custom, one evening we had for dinner soup and fish, pig's feet and brains and rissoles, and then, to our astonishment and consternation, came the pudding. The joint, we were told, was forgotten. And there was only one dish of pudding, too, to go round 20 hungry men. An omelette was imperatively ordered, of which we each had a small portion. This treatment is really monstrous, and yet unfortunate visitors were each expected to pay 3 shillings and 6pence for dinner. Their experience inland in Orotava was little better. They stayed on their first visit at the boarding house of Mr. Turnbull, which was quiet and unpretending, kept in boarding house style, although all English travellers were taken in, even for a night. The food was fair, but there was a lack of vegetables and fruit and a scarcity of milk, which the hosts attributed to the absence of a market and the difficulty of inducing the Spanish aristocracy who own gardens to sell their surplus produce. A note in the second edition observes that Mr. Turnbull is since dead, and the business now belongs to Mr. Newman Tremerne, who has moved to another house. The Kings, visiting Tenerife 20 years later, had quite a different experience during their residence at another English-owned guest house, the Buen Retiro at Guimar, which, being frequented almost exclusively by the English, as well as being owned by an Englishman, was run entirely on English lines. Margaret d'Este King recalled that they luxuriated in the familiar tastes of home, such as Irish stew and milk puddings with stewed fruit, such as we had not seen for months. Sounds delicious. A particular effect of the increase in tourism during the 1880s was the establishment of dedicated tourist hotels. Since our visit in 1883, Stone remarked 5 years later, Orotava has become the centre of considerable hotel enterprise, and the 5 hotels of the Tauro Company offer all the comforts that a European invalid necessarily demands. The Tauro Company, you will not be surprised to learn, was an English company, founded in 1887 by the British Vice Consul to Tenerife, Peter Spence Reid. As well as its hotels and health resorts, the company provided the land for the island's first Anglican church, All Saints Puerto de la Cruz. The company's Grand Hotel, wrote Harold Lee, has been adapted from the mansion of a Cuban merchant. The rooms are spacious and well furnished, the cuisine under a French chef, capital, and crucially, for an English visitor, its sanitary arrangements, a notoriously weak point abroad, are beyond reproach. The Grand's English managing director, Mr. William Harris, appears to have been quite the character. Lee describes him as a most genial host of unconquerable energy and animated by a firm intention to make his visitors happy and comfortable during their stay. Charles Edwards' account is rather less boosterish. He considers the hotel a speculation in the interest of humanity for the profit of the various marquises and counts who have subscribed the capital for its institution. Thanks to the sanatorium, he continues, the people in the northeast of Tenerife are already familiarised with the sight of Englishmen. They see them by carriage loads, or galloping themselves into health, pursued by swarms of flies. Their energy is a marvel to them. Their evident wealth is an endless subject of conversation and envy to them. But, he adds, the locals, as it turns out presciently, are dubious about the future. The wisest and best cultured of them are beginning to fear that in course of time they may have to pray for deliverance from them, even as they seek deliverance from the locusts when a southeast wind brings a ravening scourge of them upon the land. Nonetheless, having spent a few days there, he found that this grand hotel of Orotava, with its tropical gardens, lofty, irreproachable rooms, and comforting cuisine, is not to be despised. The English presence on the island wasn't always welcomed with open arms. Olivia Stone recounts a recent dispute around Orotava's little wall-enclosed English cemetery with its waving palm and other trees. This quiet-looking little God's acre, she writes, has recently given rise to a good deal of contention in Orotava. Under the heading official pig-headedness, she explains how the local authorities tried to force the English Vice-Consul Mr. Reed, he of the hotel company, to accept the burial of a well-conducted, inoffensive Freemason who'd been refused a place in the public churchyard. When Reed initially refused, the authorities went so far as to pull down the wall of the public cemetery so that the place should not be desecrated by the body being brought in through the gate. In the end, the intervention of the dead man's family persuaded Reed to allow the burial in the English cemetery, although he also had to hand over its key to the belligerent mayor. Nonetheless, English companies continued to find the Canaries a prime location for English hotels. In 1904, a quarter of a century after Stone and Lee had visited, the Russian Jewish emigre Henry Wolfson, formerly Henry Osipov, founded the Kisisana in Orotava. The new hotel was eagerly anticipated. The 1903 edition of Brown's Guide records it as in construction, to be opened January 1904, commanding position behind town, large grounds, 5 views, 300 feet above the sea. It joined the Tauro family of hotels, which now included the Aguirre and Continental at La Laguna, the renamed Grand at Orotava, now the Martianes, all under the care of the Anglo-German Trenkel family. The prolific travellers, Margaret d'Este King and her mother, the photographer Mrs. R.M. King, together with the twin-lens camera they nicknamed Cami, spent a few days at the Kisisana on a landing at Santa Cruz in the winter of 1907. They marvelled at its position, perched upon the hillside in so precipitous a spot that after leaving the carriage, one ascends 50 steps to the hall door. Arriving by ship in 1910, Florence Duquesne was less impressed. She noted the hotel perched on its steep ridge and remarked acidly that it cannot be said to add to the beauty of the scene. All my sympathy went out to those who were condemned to spend a winter in such desolate surroundings in search of health. So just a final word on leaving the islands. When it came to trying to leave, the effects of the popularity that Charles Edwards had experienced on his voyage into Tenerife, sleeping under the dining table, were even more pronounced. As Margaret d'Este King noted in 1908, it certainly is not always easy to leave Tenerife when you wish, for the English liners are so crowded with homecoming passengers from New Zealand and the Cape that it is quite a chance whether one will get a berth on any given date. Some friends of hers, who have been waiting nearly 2 months at Las Palmas for a boat to get them to Marseille, are beginning to think that the Canaries are the bourne from which no traveller returns. So in just 30 years, the facilities available to British visitors to the Canary Islands, especially Tenerife and Gran Canaria, had transformed beyond all recognition. For some, like the guidebook author Alfred Samler Brown, this transformation could be expressed in the familiar terms of colonial expansion. The 1903 edition of Brown's Guide enthusiastically embraces the expansionist trope of the pre-tourism Canaries as virgin land, in the process confidently conflating British tourism with the ostensibly universal benefits of territorial, economic, and even religious expansion. For the benefit of all, he writes, the islands have become a station where English ships are coaled, a garden where vegetables are grown for English tables, and a recreation ground or sanatorium where Englishmen can spend their holidays or recruit their health. The change in the last few years is marvellous. In Grand Canary, beautiful hotels with extensive lawns and flower gardens have sprung up from what was a sandy desert, and a Protestant church has been built. In Orotava on Tenerife, an inaccessible and useless lava stream is crowned by a spacious and handsome building, he was talking about the Grand Hotel, in whose gaily planted grounds are an English church and parsonage. By 1911, when Baedeker's new Handbook to the Mediterranean made its first English appearance, the English editor, Professor John Kirkpatrick, formerly of Edinburgh University, could inform tourists that on Gran Canaria alone, there are 2,100 English, 600 French, and 600 Germans. As a result, most of the best hotels are in the English style, and English money circulates frequently. 3 years later, the First World War broke out, and ocean-going leisure travel was suspended for the duration. When it resumed after the war, British tourists had different desires and different expectations of their holidays. But that's another story for another day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I think we have a question from Norman Weinstein. To what degree did the place of the Canary Islands in the British imagination mirror or be in contrast to the kinds of colonial exotic stereotypes also associated with the British imagination of the culture of peninsular Spain?
So thank you, Norman. Thank you for the question. So you're asking, if I understand, about the contrast between the ideas about the Canary Islands and peninsular Spain. I think that very, very broadly, we can see similarly colonialist rhetoric used about Spain, particularly the points at which British businesses, mining companies in particular, are going in to sort of take over great swathes of the Spanish landscape and mine for resources. We do see very similar. We do see sort of very similar rhetoric used, but in the Canary Islands, it's much more prominent because it's these things are being published in sort of the guides and the handbooks. They're in the discourse for ordinary people to read. So many of the mining texts were really only aimed at other specialists, whereas these books on the Canary Islands were aimed at a very, very wide readership, tourists, travelers, etc. So it's part of a continuum. But I think that the Canary Islands are sort of at the sharp end of it, and their position close to Africa opens a door for that much more sort of Orientalist rhetoric as well.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Professor Rosie Song. Who were the readers of this test, or should we call them reviews?
Hi, Rosie, great question. Most of the texts that I've quoted from today, apart from the 3 earliest ones, were written specifically to help other travellers. So some of them, like Brown's, was very much a guide. It was probably more of a directory than the others, and it was updated every few years. The earliest ones, Olivia Stone's, Lee's, Edwards, were kind of very sort of completist accounts. They were accounts of their own travels, but very explicitly aimed at people who might be thinking of going there. So pretty much all of the texts we're looking at are aimed simultaneously at a general readership, people who are interested in Spain, which many people were at the time, but also people who are going to travel there themselves, which I think is why Olivia Stone tried to reduce her book from 2 volumes to 1, but it was still too big to fit in a pocket. So I can't guarantee how many people actually took it with them. Some of the other books are much smaller and handier.
I have a question. I mean, we have been traveling with these people from New Britain in first part of the 20th century as well. And the health tourism, we can call it at that moment, was one of the main trends and the reasons why they visited the islands. Why they visited the islands? Because the climate was mentioned, but at that time, already the bathing of the sea was popular, or was just the mountains, this mixture of mountains and nice weather brought the people to the Canary Islands?
Yeah, at the time, it was very much about the climate, because most of them ended up sort of inland. So Orotava was a huge center, but they were in the Villa de Orotava, which was high up, rather than the Puerto, which was down on the coast. Yeah, I mean, what I didn't quote from, because I couldn't find many ways to make it interesting, were all of the medical texts that were published about the climate and the health-giving benefits of the climate. So in some of the studies that I was reading, some of the tourist books that I was talking about would have a chapter in the back written by a doctor who would then go through all of the details of the climate and why it was so good for you. So much more about the climate, especially early on, than the sea.
So if there are no more questions, thank you to all of our audience. Thank you, Kirsty, for your fantastic talk. And I would like to remind you that next year we continue with this series of discovering Spain, and we will announce in our webpage the dates and the regions of Spain that we will discover together with Professor Kirsty Hooper. Thank you very much. Buenas noches y hasta pronto. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.